September 2006, Kandahar Province, Afghanistan. Coalition surveillance watched Canadian forces preparing to move into the Panjwayi district, fields broken by irrigation ditches, mud-walled compounds, dense vegetation that limited visibility to a few meters. In public memory, Canada had come to be associated with peacekeeping, blue helmets, negotiation, restraint. This was something else. In Panjwayi, Taliban fighters were holding ground in strength, prepared positions, defensive depth. What followed would be widely described as the largest Canadian combat operation since the Korean War. And it would begin with events that tested everything that followed. Before we continue, a brief invitation. If you value Canadian military history, consider subscribing to the channel. And in the comments, let us know where you're watching from. Now, let's return to Kandahar. By late summer of 2006, the war in southern Afghanistan had entered a new phase. The Taliban were no longer only planting bombs and vanishing. In parts of Kandahar province, they were concentrating fighters and contesting ground openly, forcing NATO units to fight for specific districts instead of simply patrolling through them. Canada's role had also changed. For decades, many Canadians associated their armed forces with peace support operations. That reputation was real, but it was never the whole story. In public memory, Canada had increasingly come to be associated with peacekeeping, even though its military had always trained first and foremost as a combat force. In Kandahar, the mission was a combat deployment inside a NATO campaign, and Canadian troops were expected to clear, hold and build in areas where the Taliban was strongest. In early August, the Canadian battle group in Kandahar rotated. 1st Battalion, the Royal Canadian Regiment, took over from 1st Battalion Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, roughly 9 days before Operation Medusa began. The change mattered operationally because it meant new leadership, new battalion routines, and a fresh unit inheriting an increasingly violent battlefield. The battle group's commander was Lieutenant Colonel Omer Lavoy. Above him, Brigadier General David Fraser commanded Regional Command South. The Canadian force operated alongside Afghan National Army elements and relied on coalition enablers, particularly American air support and intelligence. The focal point was Panjwayi district, southwest of Kandahar city. Coalition planners saw it as a Taliban stronghold and a staging area for attacks. Intelligence estimates varied, but credible assessments suggested a large concentration of fighters. Even without a precise number, the implication was clear. The resistance would be organized and sustained. The terrain explained why. Panjwayi was farmland built around irrigation systems. Grape rows, ditches and mud walls broke lines of sight and turned short distances into exposed approaches. Compounds functioned as defensive structures with multiple firing positions. Every movement corridor could be observed from cover. Operation Medusa was designed to change the conditions in the district and was widely described as the largest Canadian combat operation since the Korean War. The objective was direct: disrupt Taliban control in Panjwayi, destroy prepared positions, and reduce the threat to Kandahar city. On paper, the plan depended on coordination. Ground units would advance methodically, engineers would manage routes and explosive threats, fire support would be integrated with maneuver. It was the kind of operation where discipline determined outcomes. That was the setup: a new battle group, a district shaped for defense, and an enemy prepared to hold ground. The operation began on September 2, 2006. Canadian and Afghan forces moved into Panjwayi with a plan that depended on coordination and control. The initial advance was deliberate. Sections moved through fields and compounds methodically, supported by engineers checking for explosives and routes that could sustain movement. Contact came early, and it did not fade. Taliban fighters engaged from prepared positions across multiple sectors. Fire was not isolated. It was sustained, overlapping, and often initiated from concealed positions within grape rows and compound walls. The terrain immediately shaped the fight. Movement slowed, visibility collapsed. Units could not always identify where fire was coming from until it was already close. What had been planned as a controlled clearing operation became a contested advance. Canadian forces adapted quickly, Movement became more cautious. Fire support was used more aggressively to suppress positions that could not be approached directly. Coordination between infantry, engineers, and supporting elements became critical in maintaining momentum. On September 3rd, the operation reached one of its most difficult moments. Canadian soldiers advancing toward a compound complex known as the White Schoolhouse encountered a well-prepared Taliban defensive position. The area had already been identified as dangerous in previous operations. Approaches were exposed. Defensive positions were layered. The terrain allowed defenders to engage from multiple angles. The engagement developed into a prolonged firefight. Canadian soldiers attempted to maneuver under fire, but the environment limited options. Irrigation ditches and vegetation restricted movement. Enemy positions were concealed and difficult to suppress quickly. Engagement distances were short, often within tens of meters. Over several hours, the fighting intensified. During that battle, 4 Canadian soldiers were killed in combat against Taliban forces: Warrant Officer Richard Nolan, Warrant Officer Frank Mellish, Sergeant Shane Stashnik, Private William Cushley. Their deaths occurred in a direct engagement with the enemy. But on that day, for the soldiers involved, the reality was immediate and unmistakable. They had encountered a determined, well-positioned enemy, and the cost was high. The firefight at the White Schoolhouse demonstrated something that would define the rest of the operation. The Taliban were not withdrawing. They were attempting to hold ground. The following day introduced a different kind of loss. On September 4th, Canadian forces were positioned near a location that would later become Forward Operating Base Masumgar. It was not an advancing column. It was a relatively static position, part of the broader operational footprint. During that time, an American A-10 aircraft was called in to provide support in the area. The pilot misidentified ground indicators. What appeared to be a target marker was not. The aircraft engaged Canadian positions. The attack lasted seconds. Private Mark Anthony Graham was killed. More than 30 Canadian soldiers were wounded. The circumstances were different from combat the day before. There was no hidden enemy in that moment, no defensive position to clear. It was an error in identification during a complex operation involving multiple forces and layers of coordination. For the soldiers present, the effect was immediate. Medical teams responded. Casualties were treated and evacuated. Units stabilized their positions. Communication channels were used to halt further engagement and clarify the situation. In some operations, an event like that can halt momentum. It can force a pause while command reassesses the risk of continuing. That did not happen here. The operation continued. Over the following days, Canadian forces adjusted their approach to match the environment and the resistance they faced. Daylight movement exposed units to fire from concealed positions. As a result, night operations became increasingly important. Darkness reduced the advantage held by defenders familiar with the terrain. With night vision equipment, Canadian soldiers could maneuver more effectively and approach positions that were too dangerous during daylight hours. Close-quarters combat became routine. Clearing compounds required breaching techniques that avoided predictable entry points. Engineers used explosives to create openings through walls rather than sending soldiers through doors where defenders expected them. Once a breach was created, infantry moved quickly through the opening to secure interior spaces before defenders could reposition. This method reduced exposure and increased the speed of assaults in confined environments. Snipers played a supporting role that extended beyond individual engagements. Positioned to observe movement, they targeted exposed fighters and limited the ability of Taliban forces to maneuver between positions. Their presence shaped the battlefield by forcing the enemy to remain concealed. Artillery and air support continued to provide essential firepower. When coordinated correctly, they allowed Canadian forces to suppress fortified positions and advance. The events of September 4th reinforced the importance of precise coordination in those systems. The Taliban continued to resist. They used the terrain effectively and maintained defensive positions as long as possible. But sustained pressure began to change the situation. As the operation progressed, lessons were being learned in real time. The difficulty of fighting in complex terrain against a determined enemy reinforced the need for heavier direct fire support. In later phases of the mission, this would contribute to the deployment of Canadian tank squadrons in Kandahar, a capability that had not been part of earlier planning assumptions. Canadian forces moved through Panjwayi incrementally. Positions were cleared one after another. Defensive depth was reduced. Supply lines for Taliban fighters became more difficult to maintain. By the second week of September, organized resistance began to weaken. On September 17th, the operation officially concluded. Panjwayi district had been cleared of large organized Taliban defensive positions. The result was widely considered a tactical success. Canadian forces had conducted sustained offensive operations in complex terrain against a determined enemy and had achieved their immediate objectives. But the cost and the events that shaped the operation would remain part of how it was understood long after the fighting ended. The effects of Operation Medusa did not end when the firing slowed. For the soldiers involved, the operation created a shift that was not always visible from outside. Combat in Panjwayi had required sustained focus in an environment where threats were constant and often concealed. That level of attention does not end immediately when an engagement ends. It carries forward. Many soldiers described a form of continued alertness. Movement, sound, and terrain features remained signals to be assessed, even in moments that were technically secure. The body did not easily separate operational necessity from rest. Sleep became inconsistent, not only because of operational demands, but because disengagement from that level of awareness was difficult. The sequence of events across September 3rd and 4th added another layer. Combat on the 3rd followed a structure that soldiers were trained to understand. An enemy was present. Positions were engaged. Losses occurred within that framework. It was harsh, but it was comprehensible within military logic. The following day introduced something different. The loss of Private Mark Graham and the wounding of more than 30 others came from a breakdown in identification within a complex system. It was not the result of a hidden enemy or a tactical misstep at the section level. It was an error within coordination. For many soldiers, that distinction mattered. It did not change the outcome, but it changed how the event was processed. Training prepares soldiers for combat. It does not fully prepare them for loss that occurs outside of that structure. Canadian military chaplains and mental health personnel working in theatre observed patterns that would later become more widely discussed. Soldiers who could describe combat decisions clearly sometimes found it more difficult to process incidents that did not follow expected cause and effect. That difference did not always appear immediately. It emerged over time. For families in Canada, Operation Medusa was experienced through notification, not observation. Each loss carried its own context. Warrant Officer Richard Nolan, Warrant Officer Frank Mellish, Sergeant Shane Stashnick, Private William Cushley, Private Mark Graham. Their deaths occurred on different days under different circumstances within the same operation. Maintaining that distinction became important not only for historical accuracy, but for how those events were understood and remembered. Public response reflected that complexity. There was recognition that Canadian forces had conducted a demanding and successful operation. There was also awareness that success in that environment carried a cost that could not be separated from the outcome. For some Canadians, the operation challenged assumptions about what their military did. The idea of peacekeeping remained part of national identity, but it did not fully explain what was happening in Kandahar. In Panjwayi itself, civilians experienced the operation in ways that were less visible in Canadian coverage. Some had left before major combat began. Others remained either by choice or because movement was not possible. The fighting affected homes, fields, and irrigation systems that had existed for generations. Agricultural land was disrupted by vehicles and explosions. Structures were damaged or destroyed. The physical landscape changed in ways that would take time to repair. After the main phase of combat, Canadian forces participated in stabilization efforts. Medical assistance was provided to civilians injured during the fighting. Infrastructure repairs were attempted where possible. Compensation programs were established for property damage. These actions reflected a continuation of the mission beyond combat. The effectiveness of those efforts varied. Local conditions, security, and long-term control influenced what could be sustained. In some areas, improvements were visible. In others, gains were temporary. For Canadian soldiers, this transition from combat to reconstruction created different interpretations of the same experience. Some viewed it as a necessary extension of the operation. Clearing an area created the possibility of rebuilding. Others saw the limitations more clearly. Control could shift. Progress could reverse. Both perspectives existed at the same time. Operation Medusa was not experienced in a single way. It produced multiple outcomes, depending on where someone stood within it. And those outcomes did not end when the operation was declared complete. Operation Medusa occupies a specific place in Canadian military history. It is widely described as the largest Canadian combat operation since the Korean War. That description appears in institutional sources and reflects the scale of coordination, intensity, and sustained combat involved. At the same time, it represents only one part of a longer campaign that extended beyond the boundaries of the operation itself. Tactically, the outcome was clear. Canadian forces, led by 1st Battalion, the Royal Canadian Regiment Battle Group, cleared Taliban defensive positions in Panjwayi and disrupted their ability to mass forces in that district. The operation demonstrated the effectiveness of combined arms in close terrain when coordination was maintained under pressure. It also revealed the demands of that kind of warfare. The events of September 3rd and 4th illustrated two different forms of loss within the same operation. 4 soldiers killed in direct combat, 1 killed the following day in a friendly fire incident. Those distinctions remain essential to how the operation is understood. In total, 12 Canadian soldiers would lose their lives during the broader period surrounding Operation Medusa, though 5 were killed during the main combat phase itself. Both numbers appear in historical accounts. They describe different scopes of the same period. For the Canadian Armed Forces, the operation contributed to institutional learning. It reinforced the importance of coordination between ground forces and air support. It highlighted the challenges of operating in complex terrain against an adaptive opponent. It also demonstrated that Canadian forces retained the capability to conduct sustained offensive operations when required. The broader outcome remains subject to interpretation. In the years that followed, the Taliban adapted their tactics. Rather than holding terrain in the same way, they shifted toward insurgent methods that were more difficult to counter. By 2021, the Afghan government had collapsed and the Taliban had returned to power. For some observers, that outcome raises questions about the long-term impact of operations like Medusa. For others, the distinction between tactical execution and strategic outcome remains clear. Canadian forces achieved the objectives assigned to them within the conditions they faced. Operation Medusa does not fit easily into a single narrative. It does not replace the association many Canadians have with peacekeeping. It exists alongside it. Canada's military history includes both restraint and combat, often within the same mission. What Medusa demonstrated was not a transformation, but a reminder. Canadian forces were capable of operating across that full spectrum. The events of September 2006 remain part of that record, not as myth and not as simplified identity, but as a documented operation defined by specific decisions, specific losses and outcomes that continue to be examined. For those who were there, that understanding does not depend on how the operation is remembered publicly. It remains tied to what was done, what was experienced, and what it required.